There are 11 different MPS disorders, and today we're going to talk about Hunter syndrome. Stay with us. Hi, I'm Alma Schneider, and today's show is the ABCs of Hunter syndrome. I'm here with Darlene Labucky. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Alma.
Sure. And we're hoping that you will tell us a little bit about what Hunter syndrome is and a little bit about your personal journey with Hunter syndrome, and most of all, to see what we can do to raise awareness in the community to help people who have Hunter syndrome somewhere in their life, whether it's in their family or their community. I'm also so happy that you're here because, as you know, we're all part of the same community, and if one person has a syndrome, I'm sure that some of those features can be very similar to other people's syndromes and disabilities, and whatever you're going to talk about is going to be helpful to a lot of people out there, not just people who have Hunter syndrome in their life. So thanks for that as well.
You're very welcome. I'm very happy to be here to help anybody that I could help.
Great.
So Hunter syndrome is a very rare, regressive genetic disorder. Mothers have a recessive gene. They pass it to their sons. Okay. In some cases, daughters might have Hunter syndrome, which is very rare because in that case, the mother and the father, it's rare anyway. But
what is the incidence of Hunter syndrome?
It's about 1 in, I believe, I believe the stat's about 1 in 100,000. Okay. It's if you go and look on the internet, you'll find that every country you'll find there are children, but it's all over the place. Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what race,
no,
what part of the country or the world. Okay, so it crosses all.
No, every Ireland, Israel. So basically, Greggie was born typical. He had a great APGAR score, the whole bit. We did not know until later on in his life that he had Hunter syndrome. So everything seemed to be typical.
And Greggie's your son?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So it's a very slow regressive disease that eventually takes their life. And
is that in every case of Hunter syndrome?
Yes, there is. The normal life expectancy is about 15. So, it's a very long journey. Yeah. It's a very, very long journey. So it's regressive where the brain retards, his speaking went away, he stopped walking, toileting. It was very hard to eat because of this disease. His whole body is not typical.
Wow. So the different features. So I know that the facial features are one piece of this, that they sort of morph over time. They change a little bit.
Yes.
And so making their physical appearance look different. And that you said there's some developmental delays start to occur.
Yes.
Are there behavioral issues that come up?
Yes, I've seen both. My son ran around like a headless chicken. I've seen other children with Hunter syndrome that were not, they were very, very unlike my son, where I was like, gee, are we sure that, he has Hunter syndrome or my son has Hunter syndrome?
Like more lethargic?
Yes, they were way slower. My son was running all over the place and very hard to catch. And and so along with being physically able to run around and do things, his brain was also retarding. So it was very, very hard for him, but it was a very, very slow regression.
And that must make it hard as a parent because you're not so focused. If you're a doctor and you document all this, you can see that. But when it's your own child, I would imagine that it's gradual, and you just think, oh, he's having a day where he's more tired, or he's having some trouble with this. We all, have days like this. So it's because it's so gradual, it must make it harder to kind of grasp that there are these changes in one direction that are constantly moving in that direction.
So Hunter syndrome is a very, it goes over a wide spectrum as far as, behaviors and things that could go wrong, but basically their body just totally shuts down because they're born without this enzyme that we all have, and they don't have.
And what exactly does the enzyme do?
The enzyme breaks down sugars. And
Okay.
so without that enzyme, sugar stores in your body. And with that storage, it might sound like, well, like, you know, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
But without the enzyme, the sugar stores in everything, their brain, their liver, their kidneys, their spleen, their tongue, their, throat, their hair is coarse. And eventually in time, it just takes over everything inside of them, and then they die.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very hard thing to be told that your son has this, and then to be told that he's going to die when he's running around and seems very like any typical child.
Yeah, and it's, some people, when they're born with a child with the diagnosis at birth, there's the upside and the downside that you know from the start, and you get adjusted to the idea, and you have more time to deal with it. And then when you have a child who seems perfectly okay, and then you get this diagnosis, it must be so. They're both devastating, but to learn this and to, I can imagine that you were just in disbelief.
He was born very typical.
Yeah, yeah.
He had a typical APGAR score. Everything was typical. He looked fabulous, and he actually was misdiagnosed when he was 3.
Oh, what was the diagnosis that they gave him?
It was called Weaver's syndrome, which basically was another word for a child who might have some, academic, might be, can't grasp onto certain things. Maybe his speech was a little delayed, and it wasn't. There wasn't much information. But at that time, the data bank that they put everything in this data bank, they came up with that, and they told us that when he was 3.
Okay.
So, go to get early intervention. Go to school, get PT, OT. Oh, the other thing was he had really high muscle tone. He was real stiff, and his joints and everything were real stiff. And once the doctors thought he had cerebral palsy, so that was before we had found out about the Weaver syndrome. So we went down quite a road.
Paths, yeah, which I'm sure was
And
very
so this was back
confusing.
in 1986. He was diagnosed with the Weavers, and then. Yeah, Weaver syndrome.
All right, well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about your personal experience with this, how you dealt with it, which, I'm sure it's going to be useful for a lot of people out there, because a lot of what you've described is, although it's specific to Hunter syndrome, it's also a part of a lot of other challenges that kids face in their families. So stay with us, and we'll be back in a minute.
At St. Jude, families never receive a bill for treatment, travel, housing, or food, because the only thing a family should worry about is helping their child live.
Because of you,
there is St. Jude.
Okay, we're back talking to Darlene Lebucky about Hunter syndrome, and we just talked a little bit about what Hunter syndrome is. I'd like to get a little information about what your specific personal journey has been with this. You mentioned that Greggie was diagnosed at 3 with Weaver's, and then when did it become fully apparent that he had Hunter syndrome?
My former husband had been in the Navy. So with the Navy, you move around quite often. So we had to move to Massachusetts. That was the next duty station, and along with that came, he had to get a physical for school. So you don't know where to go. They gave us a list, and so I did eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and I picked out this doctor. Long story short, went to the hospital. They looked at him, and they were looking at him kind of oddly, and I was getting very uncomfortable, and they said, well, we think that he doesn't have Weaver's syndrome. We think that he has a different disorder, and we want to bring another colleague in. Then they told me what they thought it was, and I was like, oh no, new place. I'm not going to deal with this, and they said, just please let's do a test. And so they didn't even tell me what Hunter syndrome was at that point. I was thinking new place, new doctor. So they said, go and see this family that lived nearby. When you meet their son, you will know because the characteristics, their traits are all very similar because it's genetic. So I went home, he got a physical, my daughter got a physical, I went home with this on my mind, and as a mother, I was like doubting, like, you know, maybe they're right, and maybe I'm wrong. So I called this mother up out of the blue, did not know her. I went over there, she looked at me, she looked at my son, she started crying, and she said, you know, I want you to meet my son, and I did, and it looked like my son's twin, and right then and there I knew that that's what he had. And
That must have been a
and then
very
she
tough
said to
visit.
me, she goes, he's running around all over the place, and her son was just sitting there, and you know, and I think he was 11, and Greggie might have been 6 or 7, and
Had her son been more like Greggie when he was younger?
she said that he was never so active as Greggie was. So I believe there's different degrees of
Right, it's on the spectrum.
of aggression and behavior. Some are calmer, some are, and I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that because
Yeah.
I've asked that 100 times. Like, you know, why is he so hyperactive all the time? And I got answers like, well, he can't hear very good. Oh, hearing loss is one of them. He can't hear very good. He has a problem speaking, communicating. And he also had feelings. And because he looked different than other children would look at him and would be afraid of him and run away from him. And he had feelings and he would cry. I really didn't know what to do.
Yeah, and was there, were you able, this is so hard for so many parents of kids with special needs because within your own family you're dealing with all these issues, and when you go out into the community to have outside people react to your child in a way that doesn't make anybody comfortable can be all the more devastating. Were you ever able to talk to people about their reactions to your son or explain about the syndrome to them to make it a little bit less frightening for them? Because as we all know as human beings, what we don't know scares us. And once we have a little bit of knowledge or education, it can help a little. But that's a heavy burden for the parent to always have to do.
Well, there's different stages. In the beginning, when I first found out that he had this horrible disease and I found out the reality of it, I walked around for months like a zombie, like thinking, there's no way. And then I'm thinking, well, this isn't going to happen to him. And I went through all that whole thing. So I went through all that.
Right.
So bringing him out, people would look at him, and like say I'd be in a restaurant, I wouldn't go up to somebody and say, oh, well, you know, you're staring at my son, he has Hunter syndrome. I tried to have as normal a life as possible, but he had no fear. He would run and scream and play, and he was very happy-go-lucky, and which brought a lot of attention to him. And then we realized the boundaries that we had with him, what we could do with him. Bringing him to a park to play wasn't a thing because he would run off and get hit by a car.
Right.
Going into a shopping mall, he would run, he would scream, he would play. So he drew a lot of attention to himself, didn't know how to handle that. So we bought a boat. And the boat ended up being the best thing we ever did. Some reason he liked the boat, he sat on the boat, when the boat was moving, maybe the rocking.
Yeah,
So
maybe the
he
soothing.
loved it. And then, you know, he would go in the water with adults holding on to him. We found something that worked for him.
Yeah.
But as far as community, you know, understanding and all of that, I lived in a military community, which is close. They are close. But maybe part of it was me. Like, I didn't want to share him, and I had to learn how to deal with this whole thing.
Yeah, and it's a very vulnerable position to have to put yourself out there, and you don't know how people are going to respond. And I think a lot of people with children with special needs experience that you're taking a big risk when you open up your life and expose your child and their issues to the world.
Yes.
Some people are very kind, some people are not, and some people just don't know what to do and maybe say the wrong thing and do the wrong thing. I think it's really interesting that you bring up the whole idea of you kind of went through different stages of bringing him into the community that didn't work. So that's something that for a lot of people, they naturally go through that. It's trial and error. The park, you want to bring him to socialize with people in the park, doesn't work. Not his place because it's dangerous. He'll run off.
Yes.
You bring them, you know, to church. It can be very, very distracting, and it's not a perfect place for him. But you, through trial and error, found that he was great on boats. So, you know, there's hope. I mean, I really like that story because it shows that you'd have to keep trying. The burden, again, is on the parent, and it can be exhausting and it can be painful to keep trying all these things and having them not go as planned or as you would like. But sometimes there is a perfect place, and it sounds like that boat was solace for him and for your family. It was a safe place that he really enjoyed, and that's really wonderful that you found that for him.
The other side to that coin is I have a daughter, and so I had to give her as normal of life as possible.
Yeah.
So we had to figure out something, because it wasn't like we're going to stay home because we can't take Greggie
Absolutely.
anywhere. We had to find some common denominator for her. And my daughter, you hear these situations where, you know, the daughter would get resentful
Yes.
against a child that needs 24/7. My daughter looked at him as special. She used to say to me, "Mommy, you could love him more." She said, he's more special. Wow. He's special, child of God. And she would say that all the time. "Don't worry, Mommy," you know. And so I don't know, we would have mother-daughter days where I would take her to go get an ice cream soda or something.
So you'd make special time for her.
And she would always say, "Mom, don't worry, you know, you could," you know, and he was very rough. So sometimes he used to beat the heck out of her, like push her down.
Right.
And she said, "Mommy, don't get upset with him." And I'm thinking, she's a little angel, you know, like, don't get angry with him, Mom. And I'm like, I didn't know how to deal with that, you know, and he just, it's almost like a typical brother-sister relationship, where the brother is like beating on the sister, except that I don't think that he knew. I know that he didn't know that he could possibly really hurt her, and he was very strong.
But she had the sensitivity from watching you to know that he required more, but it's very important, because a lot of kids, they get parentified and they feel like they have to take care of you. So it's so important, as exactly what you did. You didn't just take what you said and say, "Okay, thanks, I'm going to continue only focusing on him." You made a special point of taking her out and making her feel special, so that she could experience.
And she
one-on-one
loved the boat,
time.
and so did
That's
her
great.
friends.
So it could be a family outing. That's
and the
great.
other part of the story that's really, really essentially important in Greggie's, like, his life at that point when we were living on this military base, is that I was very quiet, and as verbal as I am and as talkative and everything, I just didn't want to share him. And I also didn't want to go up to people and say, "Well, this is my son, he has Hunter syndrome, and this is why he acts this way," because I was getting aggravated with the way people acted and stared at him. And maybe part of that was my fault. Like, maybe I could have gone up to them, but again, it was too new, too personal.
Yes, it's very, and there's a big difference between secrecy and privacy, and we're going to get to that in the next segment when we talk about some call to action ideas and how we can raise awareness and really teach people and educate them on how to be with us and how we can be with them when we have a situation like this at home. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
I was trying to fix all the things that were going on. Ryan's daydreaming, an inability to focus.
It was just frustrating to get my mom to understand what I was going through.
So that's when we talked to a doctor, and she was diagnosed with ADHD. It just explained so many things for us.
Hyperactivity isn't the only symptom of ADHD. Inattentive symptoms like Ryan's can be less noticeable. Learn more. Get the ADHD symptom checklist at keepmomming.com. Then talk with your daughter's doctor.
Keep momming.
Hi, I'm Alma Schneider. Welcome back. I'm here with Darlene Lebucky, and we're talking about Hunter syndrome. We've talked a little bit about what Hunter syndrome is, what Darlene's personal experience has been, and now we're going to talk a little bit about what the community can do and how the community can kind of gather together around someone who has Hunter syndrome. And I just wanted to, I was reading something about the worst things to say to people who have a child with issues. And I wondered, let's put a positive spin on this. You've mentioned that some people, were concerned to be near your son or didn't know how to engage, and you didn't feel comfortable reaching out to people because you didn't know what the experience would be like.
Correct.
Were there any people in your life who said the right thing or did something that made you feel comfortable having this kind of situation at home who were helpful to you?
Yes, I could probably go on, so I'll pinpoint. Well, first of all, I'll start out, and I'm going to say her name. There was a little girl, I think she was like 3 or 4 when we lived on the military base when we first found out that Greggie had Hunter syndrome. Her name is Adrienne, and she knocked on my door she would see him over at the park. I think she felt sorry for him because she saw the kids running away from him. She knocked on my door and she said, you know, do you have that little boy that runs around that has, you know, the blonde hair? And I'm like, yes, why would you, you know? She says, can I play with him? And I'm like, you want to play with him? Or, really? You want to play with him? I'm thinking like nobody wants to play with him. And then here comes her mother, Denise, and she's going, oh, don't, Adrian, what are you doing? And then she says, you shouldn't go, you know, and she says, Mommy, I want to play with him. And so then she came to the door and she introduced herself, and then
You had never met her before.
No, she lived up the street, but they did see him, and for some reason there was a connection, and we're still connected now. That was like back in 1989. Now Adrienne has 3 children of her own, and we're still very, very good friends. She came to me and asked me for help. Anything I wanted
To help you.
to help me, to help Greg. All of her children helped my son.
Wow.
They were there for him. They'd help feed him. They'd watch him. They'd play with him. And then there was another woman in our neighbor. Her name was Becky. So there was 2 women in our neighborhood. As far as outside of the neighborhood, I think a lot of that was my fault. Again, it was just being able to tell people, and I couldn't. If someone, you know, I think it became more private after I found out that he had this disease. So,
well, you're putting, again, you're in such a vulnerable position. I mean, people who have these experiences, it's so painful and difficult at home to put yourself out there with the possibility of rejection or lack of support is so daunting to so many people. So people do kind of stay isolated and stay at home, which makes life much, much harder. And you say it's your fault. I don't think it's your fault. I think it's the natural tendency that we as human beings have to keep ourselves and our families safe. So let's talk about what the community can do. And you just mentioned a little girl came to your door. So she didn't have the prejudice against people who are different. And I think that comes from the family, their family of origin. So I would imagine that her mother and her father created an environment at home where it was okay to reach out to people. And it sounds like, because you're all still connected, that is the case. So something that I take from that is, let's all talk to our kids. Don't wait for a child who's different to starting a conversation about differences and that it's okay. Let's talk about it from day one, that everybody's different. We can read books on this to our children. We could talk about people who are different, talk about being kind to someone who seems like they're alone or being mistreated, and just to reach out to them.
Yes, definitely.
How was it, what about at home? What about what can we talk to families back home about getting support in the household?
Yes, well, first of all, I wasn't one to ask for anything, and so people would start, like, people around me would say, you know, maybe you could get respite for Greggie, maybe you could get this, maybe you could get that. I found out there was a whole wealth of things that we were able to get for him.
So respite, just for people who don't know, is getting outside vendors.
Yeah, a home health aide who would come in, and he would, you know, Greggie wore diapers, he would change him, he would feed him. Nurses would come in, do his vitals, you know, so we had a lot of that support. And then Greggie's father, he would work all day. I was at home mother, so I had him at home, bringing him to doctors, bringing him to Children's Hospital in Boston, bringing him all over the place because we'd have to go to specialists and everything. I would be exhausted, sometimes not sleeping. He would come home, and although he was very, very tired, he would do a lot of the physical stuff, because later on, when Greggie was not walking, when the regression took away his walking skills, he would help with baths if the home health aide wasn't there. And it was very hard on us. You know, we were trying to be a normal couple, and we had a very sick child. We had Karen, who wanted to have this regular life and everything, my daughter. And so it can create tension.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people can relate to that at home, because you're absolutely right. You're working all day in the house, you need a break. Then your partner comes home, who's been working all day, they need a break, but the child still needs to be cared for. So what do you do? So I love the fact that you did find out eventually about respite care. So looking into resources that are out there, having friends. If you can't do it, have a friend do the research for you and find out how to get those services in place so that you can have a break. We all need, you know, a physical break, an emotional break. We need to maybe go away for a weekend, and these services are available to help take care of your children. And they're well trained, and you can train them yourself as well for the nuances of your child's needs.
There's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah.
Then we moved from the military base, and then we moved into our own home. At that point, one of my daughter's teachers' husband built handicap ramps, and this was at a point where he was in a wheelchair. And they came over and built this ramp, and then that let open other avenues where more people, you know, I never heard of that disease, and now at this point I'm more seasoned and I know more about it, I'm talking more about it. Then after that, he needed to get a handicapped bathroom. His doctor was very, very good. She wrote a letter, and we got that.
So asking for help is a theme
Well,
I'm
yeah,
seeing
right,
here.
well-
and accepting help.
Well, and it's like, you know, okay, this is what's wrong with your child. And I wasn't like, okay, I'm going to ask this one and that one for help. It was very hard for me just to come to terms with, no, let's ask people for help.
Right.
Yeah.
And it seems like in our culture, it's not acceptable, or it doesn't feel good.
I could
to
do
ask
it.
for
I
help.
could do it, yeah.
We're taught to be so self-sufficient, and we're weak if we can't do it ourselves. But the strongest thing we can do for our families and ourselves is to ask for help and find out who is going to be helpful, and not ask people who we think might say no, but really find the quality people in our lives, which isn't always so easy. And it's understandable why it's such a difficult task, because we don't always know who to go to.
No, we don't.
But it's so
It's a
important
work in
to-
progress all
Yeah,
the time.
It is, and I commend you for, you know, for getting through it. And you did, and you accepted help that people offered, and you did seek out the respite care that you needed, because we all need a break. You know, I mentioned I have a child with special needs as well, and if I don't get a break periodically, look out. You know, we might think we're okay, but then, you know, we can explode. It's just very damaging for our health, for our mental state, and we need to be the best we can be for our child.
Yeah, we had home care, which was nurses and home health aid. Then we had the respite care, where somebody would come in so we could go out. You know, again, just going places was very nervous, because I was always nervous about who was taking care of them. You know, no one could do as good as myself.
And you're right. But again, to be the best that you can be, you got to get that break. So it is a work in progress, trying to find the people, and hopefully the same people, you know, consistently, who really understand your child, to be able to make you feel as less stressed, you know, as little stressed as possible. Well, our time is up. I want to thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it's going to help a lot of people. A lot of people, I'm sure, will be able to relate to a lot of what we discussed. And you're an amazing woman. I'm going to give you a hug.
Thank you, Alma, very much.
You're wonderful, and I know it's not so easy to share these kinds of stories. It brings up a lot of stuff, but you're doing great work. And we hope to see you again on Channel 34. I'm Alma Schneider, and take care.